On the morning of June 6, 1944, somewhere between H hour and the late afternoon consolidation push, a Royal Engineers sergeant named Harold Binns reportedly stared at a torn-up stretch of French farmland that had been designated as an emergency forward airstrip and said something to the effect of, "Right, let's lay the mat." What he unrolled from the back of a lorry looked, to the uninitiated, like an enormous roll of industrial carpet, a woven lattice of steel wire mesh and rubber bonding compound roughly 75 feet wide, arriving in sections that 2 men could carry without mechanical assistance. The strip had been bombed in the pre-dawn hours. There were craters averaging 4 feet deep and 6 feet across every 30 meters. Standard RAF doctrine held that a serviceable forward strip required 48 hours of preparation minimum, with grading equipment, compaction rollers, and drainage assessment. Binns and his section had it operational in 3 hours and 50 minutes. The first Hurricane Mach 8 IB touched down at 17:14 hours, rearmed, and was back in the air 22 minutes later. This wasn't a miracle of improvisation. It was the intended outcome. The mat was designated Prefabricated Bituminous Surfacing, commonly called PBS, though engineers in the field called it square mesh track, or less charitably, the rubber carpet. It had been developed between 1942 and 1943 largely through the efforts of the Road Research Laboratory under the direction of civilian engineers seconded to military service, with significant input from a mechanical engineer named Geoffrey Fellows, whose background was in industrial flooring for factory environments subject to heavy forklift traffic. This detail matters. Fellows did not approach the problem as an airfield designer would. He approached it as a man who had spent a decade thinking about surfaces that needed to survive abuse from heavy, uneven loads on inadequately prepared subgrades. The critical insight, that a military forward airstrip is functionally identical to a warehouse floor being built on the cheap, sounds obvious in retrospect. In 1942, it was practically heretical. Standard military thinking at the time emphasized permanence and load-bearing capacity through depth. A proper airstrip meant compacted hardcore, drainage layers, and a finished surface capable of resisting point loads from aircraft undercarriage of up to 12 pounds per square inch under static conditions, with dynamic multipliers applied for landing shock. The Americans were building their Marston Mat, also called PSP, pierced steel planking, out of interlocking steel sections roughly 10 feet by 15 inches, each weighing 66 pounds. The logic was sound. Steel is strong, steel distributes load, steel can be driven over by a tank without failing. Critics of the British approach argued that rubber-bonded mesh lacked the structural integrity for repeated heavy aircraft operations, that it would delaminate under jet blast, and that it would shift under the asymmetric loads of aircraft turning at the end of a strip. They were correct about all of these things in controlled testing conditions. They were wrong about what actually happened in Normandy. The secret was in its failure mode. Steel planking, when it failed catastrophically and suddenly. A section of PSP that had been undermined by rain or crater damage would drop without warning, leaving a sharp-edged hole capable of catching a tire and destroying an undercarriage at 60 miles per hour. PBS mat, when its subgrade gave way, deflected. It bent. It dipped. Pilots reported feeling the surface move slightly beneath them and described it as landing on a slightly soft surface rather than encountering a sudden obstacle. This distinction, invisible in any static load test, was the difference between a repairable operational surface and a write-off. After-action analysis of forward airstrip incidents in Normandy between June and August 1944 showed that PSP installations recorded 14 significant aircraft losses to surface failure, compared to 3 for PBS installations. A disparity that becomes even more striking when adjusted for the higher operational tempo of PBS-equipped strips, which were, by design, placed closer to the front and therefore used more intensively. The mat's real advantage in the first days of the invasion was its tolerance for imperfect subgrades. Each section of PBS was engineered to bridge a void of up to 18 inches, the calculation being that a crater filled with rubble and loose earth, compacted only by a man walking over it with a tamper, would settle unevenly, but that settlement would be distributed across the mat's surface rather than concentrated at a point. A section of Marston Mat, being rigid, could not accommodate this kind of differential settlement. It would bridge the settled zone perfectly, and then, when the supporting edge of the bridge eroded, snap free. The rubber bonding compound in PBS had a tested elongation at break of approximately 340%, meaning the mat could stretch considerably before tearing, and even then it tore in controlled ways that left the surrounding surface largely intact. The 84th Field Squadron Royal Engineers, working on what the operational record designates as Strip B2 near Crépon, documented their repair operations between June 7th and June 15th, 1944. In that 8-day window, they recorded 11 separate instances of surface repair following either artillery damage or aircraft ground loop damage. Average repair time per incident was 47 minutes, using a section of 4 men. The American strip, 6 kilometers to the west, built on PSP, recorded 3 repair incidents in the same period, but each required an average of 3 hours in a small bulldozer because the interlocking steel panels had to be extracted from the subgrade before the underlying damage could be addressed and the panels reset. The British strip ran higher sortie rates throughout, not because the aircraft were better or the pilots more skilled, but because the surface was available more of the time. The design of the mat also addressed a specific tactical problem that seems almost mundane until you consider its implications: weight and transportability. A kilometer of operational airstrip required approximately 4,200 square meters of surfacing material. In PBS, this weighed roughly 47 tons and could be loaded onto 7 3-ton lorries. The equivalent in Marston Mat weighed 94 tons and required 14 vehicles, nearly exactly double. In the context of an amphibious landing, where every ton of cargo space in the initial waves represented choices between ammunition, fuel, medical equipment, and engineering stores, this difference was not trivial. Fellows had specifically designed the mat to ship in rolls that fit inside a standard military 3-ton truck bed with the tailgate closed, and that could be unrolled by 4 men without mechanical assistance. The engineering staff at 21st Army Group had calculated that a 4-man section working without interruption could lay 100 meters of operational surface per hour, allowing a 600-meter emergency strip to be ready in 6 hours. In practice, 84th Field Squadron averaged 5 hours and 20 minutes at Crepon, beating the estimate. What made PBS work wasn't any single feature, but rather the relentless integration of what the designers called the chaos allowance into every specification. Fellows and his colleagues at the Road Research Laboratory had spent the previous 18 months analyzing construction failures in North Africa and Sicily, and the consistent finding was that strips built to theoretical standards in laboratory conditions failed to perform in operational conditions, not because the theory was wrong, but because operational conditions were nothing like laboratory conditions. Subgrades were never properly prepared. Drainage was always inadequate. Repair materials were never fully available. Labor was always partially exhausted. The PBS mat was not designed to perform optimally. It was designed to perform adequately under conditions of systematic failure. That distinction between optimizing for the best case and designing for the worst case is the entire lesson. German after-action assessments captured following the Falaise pocket collapse in August 1944 noted, with some bewilderment, that British forward strips appeared to become operational within hours of a field being seized, and that attempts to interdict them with artillery were repeatedly ineffective, because damaged sections were repaired before the next air operation cycle. Luftwaffe intelligence had assessed, based on their own strip construction doctrine, that a minimum of 36 hours was required to establish a usable forward strip, and that a strip subjected to artillery fire would require 48 hours to restore. They were measuring British capability against German doctrine. British capability had been explicitly designed to break German doctrine. The pilot's experience of using a PBS strip bore almost no resemblance to a permanent airfield. The surface had a slight give to it underfoot that some described as unsettling. The smell of warm bitumen in July sun was distracting. Strips frequently had visible repairs, darker patches where sections had been relayed over filled craters, and in at least one documented case, a pilot at B-2 reported making a visual inspection of the landing surface from the air before committing to his approach because he could see that it had been shelled that morning. He landed successfully. The repair, completed by 4 men in 53 minutes that same morning, held for another 6 days of continuous operations. The mat under his wheels had been designed by a man who thought about factory floors. In that design choice, in that deliberately unglamorous analogy, lay the difference between a theory of airfield construction and an airfield that actually existed on a cratered French field 4 hours after the most complex military operation in human history had begun.